This is Talk Radio.
Keeping you up to date across the UK. Online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
Rob Rinder on Talk Radio.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Rob Rinder. I'm on Talk Radio with you all afternoon to the early evening of 7 o'clock, and it's sunny outside, and in here I've got a plate full of schmaltz herring. I don't think I've ever been happier. Now, of course, there are the political issues of the day. They're complex, dark and difficult. And so to unpack them and unpick them is our political panel. We've got Dr. Ashok Kumar, political economist at Birkbeck University, and Joseph Silk, communications officer at Bright Blue. As ever, we are usually, well, I'm usually going to start with Afghanistan. But what's exploded my switchboard is the discussion that we had earlier about care homes. And I tell you, the names that I'm being called, it's as if I had literally announced probably the worst alchemy ever by suggesting that given the dangers to vulnerable people in those homes, it is probably wise in fact, it should be part of the employment contract for care staff to be double vaccinated. Well, I'm being called fascist and goodness knows what else. I'm going to start with you, Joseph Silk, seeing as you're the first person I saw up there. Do you think that should be a requirement of employment? Do you think any employer should be able to force an employee to have a vaccine?
I wouldn't be in favour of rolling out mandatory vaccination across all jobs, but I think for certain careers where a duty of care for people who are vulnerable to COVID is central to your job, I think that's much more reasonable. So actually, I would be in favour of making vaccination mandatory for care staff.
Dr. Ashok.
I don't believe in passports or other forms of restrictions. In general, I think that it bodes poorly, but for the most vulnerable people in society, to work with them and to care for them, I think this is a basic requirement. I don't see how this is controversial at all.
That's how I feel about it. You know, there are just certain spaces where you say to yourself, look, it's a kind of common sense approach. Well, seeing as we all agree for a change, it's really good. Just to be clear, that's Dr. Ashok Kumar and Joseph Silk. They both agree with me. So if you want to vent some of your Twitter spleen, send it their way as well. I'm sure they're used to being called fascists and goodness knows what else. And like me, they'll probably just correct the spelling and send the tweets back. Now, and this is where things do get a little bit thorny. I started the show this afternoon by sort of having this deep and challenging reflection about what Afghanistan means for the future of the West, and really whether or not this is the kind of crucible moment of the death of the West, and certainly of America as a superpower, and the geopolitical consequences of that. Dr. Ashok, do you think it is, or do you think this is just a detail of history?
Well, I think that firstly, I don't think one thing is signals the death of anything. I think it's sort of been a protracted symptom in lots of ways of Western hegemony and Western power at a global stage weakening. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think when is it said that foreign forms of occupation and imperialism and wars and the kind of suffering that has been caused by American imperialism from 1898 to the present. And I don't have to suggest, British imperialism, especially in Afghanistan, Britain occupied that country, invaded that country in 1839, put up a puppet government in Kabul. Even Neville Chamberlain wrote an extensive report back before he became obviously prime minister that, the kind of atrocities that Britain committed there. Then in the 1980s, Britain and America funded and supported the Mujahideen against a government which, with all its problems, did introduce laws into the Constitution to enshrine the rights of women. And that becomes the Taliban. Foreign power has been used in a way often to not necessarily help people. So yes, it indicates a weakness of US and Britain. It's a symptom of that. But also, we don't need to continue to do these kinds of things around the world.
Well, I hear what Ashok says, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. But what I was really getting at, Joseph, and no doubt Dr. Ashok will come back on this, is that, we can have our history lessons and probably agree on many of the failures that Dr. Ashok sets out. But he forgets, it seems to me in any event, that this all happened at a time where China wasn't a global force, and it is now. People have failed adequately to really think about the consequences of China now becoming a countervailing power to the West and NATO and especially America.
I do worry about the decline of the West. This entire episode has had me thinking about a book that I'm sure Dr. Kumar will be familiar with, which was a book by Francis Fukuyama just after the end of the Cold War called The End of History, in which he theorized that the triumph of the United States meant that liberal democracy's dominance and capitalism's dominance was here to stay. Now, of course, only a decade later, we've had 9/11. And this narrative has been building since 9/11. We've seen America and the West stumble as the East, particularly China, has gained in strength. And now China and Russia are doubtless rubbing their hands with glee about this unnecessary humiliation in Afghanistan. I think it's worrying.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Ashok, what do you say to that? I mean, nobody suggests that it's worked out terribly well with America as the world's global police force. That's for sure. But whilst America were a dominant force, at the very least, it meant perhaps in terms of geopolitics, something more benign than China has to offer. I'm sure you've got lots of examples, Argentina, etc., and so on and so forth, say that that's not the case. But, I mean, how would you rather see the future of the world, with Chinese dominance or the dominance of the West?
Well, let's look at the evidence, right? We've had the dominance of the West, at least from the post-war period. In the golden era, you have the Vietnam War, where you had 4 million people die. Chile, of course, and Latin America, across Southeast Asia, across Africa, leaders like Lumumba, who were democratically elected, others, Mossadegh in Iran. I mean, the list goes on, the massacres, the kidnappings, Guantanamo Bay. So look, that's what the U.S. has done. China is not a benevolent state by any stretch of the imagination, but what they've done is a fundamentally different kinds of relationship to other countries. Not in every instance, but in lots of instances is through, soft power in the way that America projects itself, but often hasn't handled itself. Mm-hmm. It usually talks about soft power, but actually acts, at least, from 1898 to the present, in much more militaristic ways. So look, I'm not saying I side one way or the other, but I think if history is any indication, I think that, the U.S. is weakening in the global stage, and China's sort of economic prowess doesn't necessarily mean that more people suffer. I mean, at the end of the day, I want less people to suffer in the world. And I don't think China's dominance means that fewer people suffer compared to the US's history across the world.
Joseph Silk, I'm not in the debate. I have a strong opinion as a response. What do you say to Dr. Ashok in respect of that?
I mean, I would say that China is currently committing genocide against its own people in Xinjiang. You look at Hong Kong, you look at all of the atrocities that China is committing willingly across the world. I'm deeply concerned about a world in which China is the dominant power rather than the United States. I'm not saying the United States is perfect. No dominant global power has ever been perfect. But if you just look at the progress that was made in Afghanistan over the past 20 years, it was a fragile democracy in which there was lots of corruption, lots of problems. But I think there was progress being made, and now it's being thrown away. And I think that's absolutely tragic.
I was really rather getting you to address Dr. Ashok's point specifically about China's soft power and the extent to which that's more benign, or could be considered to be more benign than the history of American intervention. Do you think that's a sustainable argument?
Well, I think China's interventions, for example, in Burma, have been to prop up the military dictatorship there. And of course, China has their Belt and Road Initiative, which is very impressive, but that comes with their own no strings attached approach to foreign policy, which means they don't expect countries that they do deals with to uphold human rights in the same way that the West does. And so I don't think that's necessarily a force of good. It's all about making the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party more powerful, which I think is a bad thing overall for the world. Can
I ask you a question, Dr. Ashok? Are you American? I don't actually know your background. Forgive me. You sound American.
Yes, I'm American, born and raised in Chicago, but I've lived here for about 12 years. So.
Okay, so you're a Londoner, really, by the sounds of things. Okay, but nevertheless, Dr. Ashok, it's a difficult question. Are you proud to be American?
I'm proud of my friends and family in America. I'm certainly not proud of America's history and foreign policy. To Joseph's point, and the question you've asked, it's not like America says you have to be a country that respects democracy and human rights. One of the biggest partners of America is Saudi Arabia, where they cut people's heads off for adultery. I mean, I don't really think that there is empirically the evidence. Yes, they say that they support those things, but I would love it if America and Britain, for that extent, would actually support governments. They use democracy often, and they support sort of tangentially sort of policies, but when it comes down to it, if a country has oil and they're an autocratic regime, they're happy to defend them at the UN. They're happy to support them. They're happy to finance them. So yeah, I think that's the history of the West in lots of ways, the contemporary history of the West.
Sure, and there's lots of criticism about that can be made, but I'm asking you really on a different level, and whether we have an entitlement to model it across the world is a complex discussion. Both of you make valid points. I'm just wondering, it strikes at the core of this issue. Do you believe that it's okay to say that Western liberal democracy and the democratic values that have gifted you so much, freedom, etc., your education, say the very least, is it okay to say that that's better than other forms of government, Dr. Ashok?
Well, I think that the U.S., and again, that's why I keep trying to point out the empirical evidence.
I'm talking about I'm just saying, in principle, is it okay to say that freedom and democratic values are better, yes or no? I mean, what?
Freedom, that these things don't mean anything.
Well, you had it. I'm talking about for the citizens of America. Let's not take it globally.
No, in America, I don't think it exists for the citizens of America. You have 2.6 million people in American prisons, more than every other country combined. Mm-hmm. You do not have a welfare state. Right. There depends on which state you're in, but if you're living on the street, eating out of garbage cans, they do not care in America. Mm-hmm. So I don't think freedom, what kind of freedom? Freedom to die because you don't have childcare? Freedom to be imprisoned because you don't have enough to eat? What is freedom? Why? Because you have a vote? Vote for one corporate party or vote for another corporate party. Right. Yeah, it's better than not having the vote, but I'd rather people have some shelter and some food and some protections that do not exist in America. They've never existed in America, because America, at the end of the day, to quote Tocqueville, the business of America is business. Okay. And that's to the detriment of people.
Joseph Silk, where would you like to live?
I have absolutely no problem with saying that I think liberal democracy is a better way to live. And I don't think it's either or. I don't think the choice is between abject poverty in a ruthless anarchic capitalist system and the communist repression of China. I don't think that's the choice we have before us. I think we can have a free and democratic society in which the most vulnerable are looked after.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ashok Kumar. I always wish we had more time, and Joseph Silk.